Video 5 on this staggeringly clean 68 Super Reverb. In the first video, we discussed the pros and cons of restoration versus keeping everything original. In the second video, we showed changing the AC wiring and the screen grid resistors on the output tubes. The third video, we did the plate resistors in the phase inverter. The fourth video, we did these cathode bypass caps and the bias board. On the bias board in the previous video, I did not show the after very cleanly, and I realized at the end of it, it looked like there was a bunch of flux on the board still. I did clean that off, and so aside from the new components, it all looks pretty factory if the factory had used these components in 1968. Anyway, I just wanted to say before I get started on the next section, which is the filter caps, that I try to group all these amp videos in an organized way, so I create playlists. So there's a playlist just for this Time Machine 68 Super Reverb. There's another playlist of vintage Fenders that this also belongs to. I have not figured out yet how at the end of the videos to say, and to have the links to part 1 and part 2, or control what's suggested next by YouTube. I'm not sure how that's done. I need to look into that. But if you're interested in this video, it is in a playlist. So if you go to my channel, click on playlist, you'll see all the videos of this amp and all the vintage Fenders and Marshalls and Voxes and very specific things. So if there are more than one video on a particular amp, there'll be a playlist just for that amp, and then there'll be a playlist of the broad category the amp falls into. Because I've noticed that people will heavily watch the first video in a series, and the second one gets fewer views sometimes, and the third one sometimes fewer. And it's possible, highly likely in fact, that people were just bored with any particular topic or one particular amp, but I also think maybe it's possible people don't know there's more than one video out there on that particular amp. So if the video says part 1, there either is a part 2 and possibly more, or there soon will be. So keep an eye out for that. Anyway, let's get to the filter caps. Okay, here are the original filter caps. Now on this video, a lot of the techniques I use will be those that I showed on the bias board changing on the previous video. And there is a video from a Vibrolux Reverb that I did that I showed the entire process, which will be pretty much the same on this, with the exception of this series cap thing here and the voltage balance resistors kind of hidden underneath. So this is going to show just kind of the highlights of the process as things progress. I'm not going to show every minute of that. I'll link to that Vibrolux video in the description below if you want to see the same thing from start to finish. But I think the first thing I'm going to do is disconnect this end of all these capacitors, and then we'll measure what the actual capacitance is in 2021. And again, as I mentioned in the bias board video, I am in between ESR meters. So even if these all measure 20, 20, 20, 70, 70, that doesn't mean that these capacitors are actually good. I imagine if I had my ESR meter that some of these would be showing way too much equivalent series resistance. But you can see these little bulges beginning to start here and there. And that's a sign of complete failure imminent. And it's always best to do preventative maintenance on amps like this, because when these fail, they can fail in catastrophic ways, and they can burn all this stuff. And right now, it all looks immaculate, so let's keep it that way. Okay, I took measurements of the capacitance of all these caps here. The actual capacitance. This is supposed to be 70, 70, 20, 20, 20. 95.9, a little bit on the high side. 74.8, and these are all between 23 and 27. So as far as measured capacitance goes, these all still measure fine. They all feel very dry and lightweight and shaky, which it does not bode well. And they have these beginnings of bulges, so they are going by the wayside. And these old resistors are going to get changed out. They are still within spec, but carbon composites soak up so much stuff, and all this will get redone. Now, since the process on this amp started with the concept of perfect playability versus perfect originality, there are those who would see this and say, oh, those all measured fine. Why would you possibly change them? Well, they measured fine as far as capacitance. That does not mean that they're going to maintain that. And as I said, I don't have an ESR meter this week, which is, I feel kind of naked without it. But on any capacitor this old, it doesn't matter if it measures good today, because it is 54 years old on these electrolytics. And electrolytics do not last 54 years working at their peak. Here's a photo of a 72, actually there's a little excerpt of a video of a 72 Super Reverb, where you can see a fairly typical capacitor failure, where they just begin to leak really badly. And that's not great. You don't want a capacitor to leak like that, because you can have shorts, which can damage other things in the amp. And here's a photo of a 69 Super Reverb, where you had catastrophic failure, and what can happen. And it totally charred the board and all the wires, and I had to redo everything, which became a very expensive repair. And luckily, nothing else in the amp was damaged by those shorts. It just blew fuses. But sometimes, if the wrong thing shorts in the power supply, you can take out transformers. And it's the iron, the old Schumacher transformers in these amps, that makes them intrinsically valuable and good. So everything we can do to preserve those old transformers, plus with new high quality capacitors, this will sound much better than it has probably since about, 1978. As I said, I'm just going to show the highlights. So everything off, everything cleaned, like on the bias supply board. All new jumper wires installed. 2-watt resistors, replacing the old 1-watt carbon composites. These are metal films. These are great. The only ones which are soldered in place right now are these 220K voltage balance resistors here, just because once these filter caps are in place, I won't be able to reach these eyelets. And I like to screw everything down with the board to the chassis before applying these solder joints, so that none of these solder joints flex or crack when the board moves when it's screwed in place. So let me put the new capacitors in place, and we'll put it all back together on the chassis. All right, everything in place. Nothing is soldered yet except those 2 resistors I mentioned. A little bit of silicone underneath each capacitor to adhere it to the board, because these are not the same size as the old ones, and the foam on the top of the doghouse will not touch these. And this is better anyway. All the leads have that little bit of bend to them, so there's no tension on those leads. And as the silicone sets up, this will take all the stress, so there will be no stress of the weight of these on these leads. And you can see that the leads are bent over for some mechanical support. And when I screw this down against the backer board, against the chassis, they'll be compressed in place before any solder is applied. That way, none of the solder joints will be bearing the weight of the capacitor. Now, a lot of techs, I know I've mentioned this a lot, but just in case it's the first time you see one of these videos, they will cut the old lead of the old capacitor, maybe here, and twist the new wire to that lead and solder that. That is kind of okay in a pinch, but is not as good, because you then have a solder joint here and a solder joint here, and if something goes wrong in here, it's just kind of a fragile bridge. I prefer to have a solid lead like it was done from the factory. Other techs will have the old lead still in this eyelet, especially on the ground side, where the old leads were used as jumpers. and they'll just tuck the end of a new capacitor into that solder joint using the solder as glue. So there's no crimp underneath the board, no support. It's just the lead goes in here, and oftentimes they won't use any silicone or any kind of thing to give these support, so they just rattle around, and all the stress is on the solder joints, and they fail. I try to make these amps proof against potholes. Okay, all done and ready to go back into service for the next 15 years or so, hopefully. A little bit of blue painter's tape that won't leave any residue on the board, just showing that it was recapped 5/2/21. That should hold up long enough for the next few services the amp needs, so people will know when all this was done. I don't sign the chassis of 50s and 60s Fenders because that's just a bit more ego than I have. But the owner does get detailed invoices and service records with my contact information on that. So, yeah, it's easily proven if I did the work on an amp. You'll have the service record I gave in electronic format with the serial number and all that fun stuff. But anyway, this one is ready for service. Let's put in the AC cable, the new one, and see what happens when we give it some power. New hospital grade power cable, very nice, very pretty. Just to repeat what I said in the second video, the neutral goes here to the tie-in to one of the primaries on the power transformer, and the hot goes to this inside lug of the fuse holder, and then from there to the switch to the other primary. And someone in one of the comments asked, though it had disappeared seemingly, why do the fuse before the switch? They always do it the other way. Well, number one, it's safety code. And the other reason is that sometimes there will be a short in a switch. And it's good to have that fused so that you don't trip wall circuits or possibly damage the wiring at the house or wherever you're at, just in case someone has the wrong fuse in the house, though that's less likely. But anyway, it's enough that it's code. Now, ground wire on this, you notice, is long. It's going to a new chassis solder joint there. Why is it long? It doesn't look very neat. Because the other code is if you have a 3-conductor non-IEC power cable in one of these, is that the ground wire must be longer than the hot and neutral. So if the cable retainer were to fail, the hot and neutral would pull free from the chassis, from the connections before the ground would, which is important. That way, if the hot were to break free and then touch the chassis, instead of making the chassis live, it would trip a circuit breaker or fuse. It's just a way of keeping the chassis safe in the event of a catastrophic power cable failure, which is rare but could happen. So this is an overlooked part of safety code. Not a lot of amp techs pay any attention to, though most amp techs don't pay any attention to safety codes, and all this stuff gets wired poorly. All right, in the previous videos, we did the big, obvious stuff necessary to make this amp great. I'm about to power it on for the first time. But first, let's make sure all these pots are tight and clean up the front panel a little bit as we go. It's one thing to have an amp that sounds fantastic, but keeping these pots tight helps that. Input jacks as well, and there's no reason it can't look great in the process. All right, remove the input jacks because I'm going to clean all that hardware. I've tightened up the nuts on the pots. The earlier 60s Fenders use the pot to chassis connection, or pot to brass panel connection for ground. These have a dedicated ground wire from each pot, lug 1, as necessary to the brass. but it's still important this be tight, though in this case I don't have to remove them all and clean that. I'm also going to clean the inside of this area for each input jack to make sure I have good contact. But first, I'm going to get rid of all this dust here. Pause a little bit through. There's the dust, and then where I've cleaned. That's just WD-40. Does a real good job on these. Also tightened up the lamp. And all this little fuzz here, that's from the paper towel I used to apply the WD-40. Just no real pressure. I don't want to do anything that might remove any of this ink. But just a swipe with WD-40 does a lot of good. And then I've got a lint-free towel I'll use to wipe out that excess. And getting in there and cleaning this inside of the switches and tightening these screws a little bit helps. So let me do that as well, and they'll be all pretty. That's looking nice. Now on these old knobs, let me pause this and set a holder for this part. These knobs mostly just have dust on them, and you have to be careful with fender knobs. I've got one of those machines that you put in there, even with just distilled water, and it vibrates for a while and all the little stuff comes up. And that can be real nice for a lot of components. But I have found that the ink, the white ink down there on these fender knobs in the late 60s wants to come up with water. And I don't want these things to be pale blue or pale gray. I want them to look like this when they come back. So since there's just a little bit of dust there in the crevices, and the rest of it's just a little spit polish with WD-40 does a nice job. And as long as I don't use any real pressure on the lettering, that wipes up pretty cleanly. I think I'm just gonna do these quick by hand with some WD-40. If I see any real stubborn areas in the knurling, I can get in there with an old soft bristle toothbrush if necessary, but I don't think that'll be really all that necessary. The main thing is just, I see that all funk on that silver dome, silver dish rather. Just get in there, and that shines up real nice. The earlier 60s stuff you can put in that vibration tank I've got with just a little distilled water and then clean up. And other devices that I use that for, sometimes you want to use a little bit of drop dish soap or white vinegar, but you gotta be careful with knobs. When in doubt, don't do anything. This is not my first rodeo, and I remember when I discovered that the late 60s fender knobs like to lose their paint. I was pretty horrified. Fortunately, it was an amp where very few of the original knobs were still in good shape. Most of them had been chewed up from repeated droppings, and the owner didn't particularly care. So I apologized, and I bought him a new set of reproduction knobs, and he was happy with that. And I just filed it away under things I will not do again. Just get a little fresh WD-40 on this bit of paper towel. It's the little things that make a nice difference. You know, you and I know from watching these videos all the things that I do inside the amp. Most people will just hear how it sounds, which is good. But the reality of life is even more people will judge it by how it looks. So it doesn't matter how beautiful everything is on the outside, on the inside rather. If I were to turn it all covered in dust with dull, dusty knobs versus this. So I'll take another cloth and get all the excess WD-40 off. But that exciting work can be done off camera. Well, that's a lot nicer, don't you think? One more thing to check. When you remove, replace, and retighten the input jacks, sometimes this solder joint here between the two jacks can crack. That looks fine. And that looks fine. But it's always good to check. Alright, let's put some tubes in this thing and fire it up. Okay, fired up for the first time with its tubes. And right now it is biased about 54% idle dissipation, which would be fine, except that the bias trim pot is almost at its max level, which means I need to decrease the value of that resistor there just to give the bias trim pot a better range. Because right now, almost all the way clockwise gets you in the mid-50s. And I'd like that to be more in the middle of the pot's range. Just a little finer range just for different pots, different tubes that you might put in this. Let's try the amp though. Let's just turn the normal volume. That sounds good. I hear a little bit of microphonics. I think this thing has its original preamp tubes. I think all the tubes in this are original except for the output tubes, which are rubies. I will confirm that, but that's not unusual. Let's see how this channel is sounding. So Strat, normal channel on volume 3, treble and bass at noon. Bright switch. Channel seems pretty darn healthy. Let's go to the reverb vibrato channel. Again, volume at 3, treble mid space at noon. Bright switch. Need to clean that switch a little bit. No scratches on the other stuff, that's good. Let's check the reverb. Sounds good. Make sure it doesn't oscillate at high levels. So far, so great. Let's see if the tremolo is working. Hook up my little dummy RCA plug to get the tremolo circuit on. Hopefully that'll start some flashing lights. That's a real good sign. I don't hear any ticking, any thudding, so I think that's a fantastic. Remember, only 2 resistors have been changed on the entire preamp board. The other change resistors are just in the power circuit. Only cathode bypass cap's been changed. Everything else in this is still 1968, which is, in the case of this particular amp, pretty much identical to what you would have found in 1967. I'll triple check the microphonics on those tubes. I may need to clean those sockets another time. Let's make sure the normal channel handles higher volume stuff, okay? Seems a little weak to me. That might be the old tune. think that should have a little higher output. Let me play some tube swapping stuff. But I think the next time you hear this amp, it will be through its real speakers for a real playing test with real mics and all that fun stuff. But before I go there, I'm going to see if I need to clean tube sockets, see what tubes are actually in this. I gave it a cursory glance when it first came in. I don't recall right now. I think they're all original. And sometimes tubes get weak. The one in V1 sounds a little weak to me. And then, before I put it back in its cabinet, I want to let it run for a good while with a metal panel on top to let it get hot, because this amp has not been used in many, many years. Hasn't been powered on. And I want to give it a shot at baking itself first to see if any stray noises come out of nowhere once it has been running for many hours in a closed cabinet environment where the heat builds up inside. So, yeah, it's boring stuff, but it's really important. All that said, so far, all the signs point to this thing just being phenomenal, and we're very close to that point.